The situation right now. Poor and working class people are especially disenfranchised by our government. People are tired and angry, and we all feel let down by Labour. We want change. We've lost our community spaces, our local areas aren't maintained, work is becoming more and more outsourced by technology, and many skill sets tied to industry are being less and less valued, and we're all being told it's the fault of foreigners. It's in the idea of a need for change that Farage's reform is gaining momentum. In a climate of anti-immigrant, anti-queer, anti-reproductive rights, the us and them sentiment is powerful. Regardless of how people may be connecting with reform, there's no denying that the pillars of its campaignings are anti-other, anti-migrant, and anti-queer. So, reform represents an easy vote for individuals who hold racist, transphobic, and homophobic views. Reform states, record mass immigration has damaged our country. The small boat crisis threatens our security. Multiculturalism has imported separate communities that reject our way of life. Divisive, woke ideology has captured our public institutions. Transgender indoctrination is causing irreversible harm to children. So what does reform think of trans issues? Well, ultimately they think that trans ideologies are a waste of taxpayer money. But things do go deeper. In 2013, in a podcast, Farage said Margaret Thatcher's open-mindedness was responsible for today's tolerance in British society. When reminded of Thatcher's support for the homophobic Section 28, which banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools, Farage said, that was done because she feared some of the very, very extreme left-wing elements within the teaching union. And went on to say, but Margaret Thatcher, her period as our Prime Minister, was one, I think, of real advancement for gay people in our society. Right now, we are living in a Section 28-esque climate of anti-trans sentiment, spearheaded by Reform UK, which aims to set its voters against the trans community, as if we are somehow not part of and don't contribute towards society. Reform UK aims to ban transgender ideology in primary and secondary schools and states that transgender indoctrination is causing irreversible harm to children. A terrible and saddening thing that's happening recently perfectly shows not only Reform's attitude towards trans teachers, but also their emboldened and above-the-law mentality when it comes to dealing with minorities who represent the other. Just this week, avid Reform supporter Tommy Robinson confronted a non-binary teacher with filming crew outside of the school they work at, stalked them to their home address and even onto their property. Despite being asked to desist, Tommy continued to challenge them for forcing children to address them as mix or be punished by getting sent out of class. The local MP, former Tory Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, publicly shared a letter he'd addressed to the head teacher of that school expressing his concern about the matter. But instead of advocating for the teacher, Williamson reiterated the claim that the school had taken steps to remove children from educational classes in order to teach them pronouns, and I strongly believe a school's main priority should be academic rather than diversity box-ticking exercises. However, the school said claims made in these posts about disciplinary measures for students are wholly inaccurate. The scenarios described online do not reflect actual events at our school, and our school is a community built on mutual respect. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind, and we have established support in place for any member of our society, our school community, who has been affected. No doubt that the non-binary teacher can't return to their work. What must the children think about their school teacher being treated in this way? The Department for Education for the UK has outlined guidance for primary schools on how to approach relationships, sex, and health education. They say the focus in primary school should be on teaching the fundamental building blocks and characteristics of positive relationships, with particular reference to friendships, family relationships, and relationships with other children and adults. In 2019, the Department for Education made it mandatory for schools to teach about LGBT issues. And here's what they outlined. In teaching relationships, education, and CSE, schools should ensure that the needs of all pupils are appropriately met and that all pupils understand the importance of equality and respect. Schools must ensure that they comply with relevant provisions of the Equality Act 2010, under which sexual orientation and gender reassignment are among the protected characteristics. Schools should ensure that all of their teaching is sensitive and age-appropriate in approach and content. At the point at which schools consider it appropriate to teach their pupils about LGBT issues, they should ensure that this content is fully integrated into their programs of study for this area of the curriculum, rather than delivered as a standalone unit or lesson. Schools are free to determine how they do this, and we expect all pupils to be taught LGBT content at a timely point as part of this area of the curriculum. Interestingly, reform has been going into schools, and on the 30th of January, Jamie Fern, Deputy Chair of Reform Coventry South, visited a school to talk all things Reform UK. Aren't schools supposed to be politically neutral? Existing statutory requirements of political impartiality cover all schools, regardless of the type of funding arrangement that they receive. This includes independent schools. These legal duties mean schools must prohibit the promotion of partisan political views and should take steps to ensure the balanced presentation of opposing views on political issues when they are brought to the attention of pupils. So what happened there? This is demonstrating that reform, what it stands for and who it represents, is something that any child can be exposed to. What Reform UK fails to note is that LGBT people were also once children. And I can say for a fact that every single one of us would have benefited from more understanding and compassion in our school environments. How cool it would have been to have a non-binary teacher who's so visible. Respect and understanding are the pillars of any caring society, and it seems like Reform wants to eradicate those pillars under the banner of anti-wokeness. Reform say they want to protect children, but in the same breath want to out them to their families and others if they indicate any sign of non-conformity, which is dangerous for those living in families where being LGBT+ is a risk. We already know the impact of creating a hostile school environment for LGBT children. We can simply look what happened to Brianna Ghey, which is 3 years ago to this day, whose story is never amplified by Reform. Now I'm going to talk about the EHRC and the Supreme Court ruling. The EHRC claims to be an independent statutory body with the responsibility to encourage equality and diversity, eliminate unlawful discrimination, and protect and promote the human rights of everyone in Britain. They claim to enforce equality legislation on age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. These are known as protected characteristics. The EHRC is referred to as Britain's Equalities and Human Rights Watchdog, appointed by the government. In 2018, the EHRC supported the Gender Recognition Act, seeking to make it easier for transgender people to access resources and care. But in 2022, Liz Truss appointed Baroness Faulkner, which marked a drastic change in attitude towards transgender people. The LGBT Foundation said they severed ties with the EHRC. Stonewall became deeply concerned as EHRC staff were acting against the interests of LGBT+ people. Britain's Equality Watchdog had met with anti-trans groups under the guise of creating conversation and an open door policy to reflect whole opinions, which would both support and counteract issues related to trans rights. Leaked emails shared by Vice showed senior leaders and the newly appointed chair, Baroness Faulkner, had personal, private meetings with leaders of anti-trans accused organisations such as Fair Play for Women and the LGB Alliance. They say that transitioning is horrifying and leads to a life of infertility, loss of sexual feeling, continuous medication and appalling surgery. The NHS is carrying out experimental surgeries on children. At this point, many employees quit Britain's Equalities and Human Rights Watchdog, following the EHRC becoming what they felt to be the enemy of human rights. Baroness Faulkner, who heads the EHRC that regulates equality laws, described the Supreme Court judgment as a victory for common sense. The Supreme Court ruling was not a victory for women's rights, however. It was a victory for patriarchy, division, and active discrimination. People were made to feel like their understanding of womanhood was being taken away from them, that it somehow meant less because languages was broadening to include a multiplicity of experience. Looking at gender, man and or woman or non-binary or whatever, was being understood to be an expression different from one's sex. But now we seem to have taken a step back, where a woman is now defined by her biological functions. People are using the Supreme Court ruling as a scapegoat to enforce discrimination. Centres and spaces are proactively creating barriers to trans plus people accessing toilets. The climate of biological essentialism and biological scrutiny that has been created affects all women. It has only furthered how disproportionately transgender hate crime affects members of the community who are not white. In addition to this, many cisgendered women who appear as butch and are also being screened and prevented from using toilets, such as with transgender men who are being prevented from using toilets that align with their birth sex, meaning they can't go anywhere. It's one thing to keep trans people out of single-sex toilets, but when it comes to hospitals and care, the situation becomes a matter of life and death. This next page, I am talking about suicide, so just giving you full warning. This is taken from an article by Erin in the Morning, which she wrote only this week, as FOI has just been done, and it's crazy. A Freedom of Information request to the National Child Mortality... Please, it's fine. A Freedom of Information request to the National Child Mortality Database reveals that 22 trans children under 18 died by suicide in England in 2021 to 2022 alone. In 2024, whistleblowers connected to internal discussions at the Tavistock Gender Clinic revealed to the Good Law Project that employees were privately alarmed by a spike in suicides amongst transgender youth, following severe restrictions on care on the aftermath of the Bell versus Tavistock ruling. This information was never made public, with administrators concerned that it could cause reputational damage to the clinic. Following the Good Law Project's reporting, the UK government commissioned a report known as the Appleby Report that claimed there were only a handful of suicides and denied any increase, with many anti-trans political figures and activists then patting themselves on the back and absolving themselves of any blame. Now, after years of fighting for the data, the Good Law Project has received responses to the Freedom of Information requests from the National Child Mortality Database, the NCMD, and discovered that the government reports significantly undercounted transgender youth suicides. Death rose roughly fivefold in the immediate aftermath of the Bell versus Tavistock ruling, with a devastating 22 trans kids taking their own life in a single year. The data, obtained through a Freedom of Information to the NHS-funded NCMD, paints a devastating picture. Between 2019 and 25, 46 trans children under the age of 18 died by suicide in England. The year-by-year breakdown is stark, and the massive spike in 2021 to 22 follows directly on the heels of the Bell versus Tavistock ruling in December 2020, after which NHS England imposed restrictions on gender-affirming care for young trans people. By contrast, the Appleby Report, the government's official response to inquiries from whistleblowers about rising suicides, examined only the narrow pool of youth who had actually become patients of the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock, finding just 12 total suicides over 6 years, including adults. The NCMD data captures nearly 4 times as many deaths among children alone. Importantly, for later years, suicide reports have not been completed, and it is likely that some of the numbers for later years will rise significantly. The UK government fought hard to keep transgender suicide data from the public, and now, 2 years after its attempt to bury the deaths of children, that data is out. Even what has been released is limited. The NCMD's own response indicates that its methodology may not capture all transgender youth suicides in the country, meaning the true toll is likely higher. But what is known is the grisly impact that anti-trans restrictions have had on the youth of England. I'm afraid the awful news continues, as I'm going to be talking about the loss of my beautiful friend due to transphobia. My beautiful friend Joelle, also known as Tristessa, was stolen from us in October 2023. The NHS certainly had a lack of resources, but what tipped the balance between survival and death was transphobia. On October the 2nd, 2023, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, announced at the Tory conference that there would be an intention to not have trans women in women's wards or men's wards. On October the 3rd, the very next day, Tristessa went into hospital following a diagnosis of blood cancer, which, for the record, is very easily treatable, with a 91% recovery rate if treated as a medical emergency. The remaining 9% often experience remissions. Upon arriving at the hospital, Tristessa was asked to scale her pain out of 10. As someone who has lived with kidney transplant and kidney failure, she said it was the most pain she had ever experienced in her life. The doctor interpreted her pain as a score of 2 out of 10. When arriving at the hospital, her mum Jane saw that there were plenty of empty beds in both the male and female wards, but there were no beds in the private rooms. The hospital chose to act on the recent announcement by Steve Barclay. Tristessa was forced to wait 16 days in the completely wrong ward, being denied chemotherapy until she could reach a single patient room in the haematology ward. Doctors would say they were going to move Tristessa into a room, but it would be taken almost immediately. She was waiting for a single room because she was trans. Tristessa pleaded with the doctors to be given treatment. She didn't care whether she went into a male or a female ward or even the corridor at this point. She just wanted treatment. Tristessa's mother desperately advocated for her, but she was denied care. This wasn't policy, it wasn't a directive, it was something that the hospital chose to interpret. Jane has been interpreting the data following the loss of her daughter. She saw that the cancer markers in her blood were at 504 when Tristessa arrived at the hospital. By day 10, it was 705. Above 750 is dangerous grounds. The day Tristessa finally received chemotherapy, the cancer markers were well above 2,000. Tristessa received a lack of solidarity, a lack of empathy. She was othered. She wasn't treated with empathy or respect. She was even misgendered in her doctor's notes. The loss of Tristessa is as a direct result of the anti-trans climate that we live in, to the extent that doctors wouldn't act on their Hippocratic oath to preserve life because of legislation. Jane is working tirelessly to take on the EHRC. She's been able to acquire legal aid but will need funding to make it possible. We are still working on the fundraiser. It's a matter of Jane's ability to do things. But if you are able to help either by sharing or donating, please come speak to me and I'll take your email address. That would be really appreciated. The funding will go towards paying for legal costs, but also supporting Jane, who's basically been out of work since the loss of her daughter. And she's been fighting this every day for like the past year and a half. And the trans exclusionary community is not radical. They are not progressive. They are enforcing gender ideologies based on biological essentialism and scrutiny. It has already been so hard for queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people. I don't know a single trans person who hasn't experienced some form of violence, be it verbal abuse, bullying and harassment, even physical abuse. Some of my friends and trans siblings have been hospitalized and even lost their lives due to hate crimes inflicted upon them. I too have been physically assaulted on the streets of Brighton, simply for being myself, for being visible. We already don't feel safe to feel visible, to show ourselves and connect with wider society. All this talk of cisgender women being unsafe, and many of us find it hard to even leave our homes. We're rarely even using public toilets because we feel unsafe. We don't feel safe in the women's toilets because we risk being scrutinised or harassed. We don't feel safe in the men's toilets because we risk being predated or facing violence. Not to mention the fact that men's toilets are disgusting. Sorry. Truth. I work with children. I'm proud to say that I am a respected role model for them. I teach them rules about respect, kindness, and acceptance. They connect with me as a person and not an idea. I teach roughly 140 children a week, which extends to about 180 in the school holidays. The children are from many different backgrounds, both affluent and impoverished, and I can tell you that they are all desperate to express themselves, to connect with something that inspires them and makes them feel that who or what they are is okay. They connect with stories of empowerment and friendship. Is there a bigger and brighter story of connection, empowerment, and community than the queer community? We refer to our community as dolls, sisters, and angels. TERFs actually know nothing about the collective harmony of sisterhood, siblinghood, brought together by oppression, by the shared experiences of joy, violence, and persecution, and becoming. I've got one last thing to say. I've probably gone way over time. I'm very sorry, Ted. And that is about hope. There is so much darkness in the world for trans people right now, but there are also so many amazing people and groups and spaces working so hard to uplift our community. It's important for us to remember our uniqueness and community and power. There is no right or wrong way to be trans, in the same way there's no wrong way or right way to be yourself. It is never too late to seek out who you are. Trans is a Western term, but there are many cultures that incorporate gender variances, such as Two-Spirit, Afafine, Mouche, and many, many more from many different cultures. We have always been here, and we always will be. I'd like to do a shout out to the Trans Liberation Front, based in Brighton. Trans Pride, I hope there's going to be a Trans Pride beginning here, if there's not one already. Trans Bashback, which is a recently formed activist collective who are doing really serious, fabulous violence against buildings. Can you believe? So yeah, go check them out. What can you do? Be authentic. Doesn't always have to mean being visible, okay? Listen around you. Challenge discrimination. That's if you're allies. Be prepared to be bold. It can mean simply crossing the floor and saying hello or complimenting someone. It can mean filming discrimination. It can mean standing up and or speaking out. Also shout out to the Eastbourne Transgender Association. That happens every Thursday at the Final Frontier, 6 to 8 p.m. And there's also a trans mask meetup, which happens between 4 to 6 p.m. And that's on the 7th of February, the 7th of March, and the 4th of April this year. So big up to them. That's amazing that the local trans community is proactive and supporting the community. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Sorry for going over so long.